The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished concrete floor of Training Hall 7 as Cadet Marcus Rivera stood before the weapon display case, his reflection distorted in the gleaming steel of a dozen different blades. For 3 months, he had failed every single knife combat assessment at the Terran Military Academy. Today would be different. Today, he would rewrite everything they thought they knew about blade work. The standard Academy doctrine was carved in stone, as immutable as the laws of physics that govern stellar navigation. Forward stance, dominant hand grip, thrust and parry, advance and retreat. Every movement calculated, every technique refined through centuries of military tradition. It was a beautiful system, elegant in its precision, devastating in its efficiency. It was also completely wrong for someone like Marcus. Standing 6 feet 2 inches with the lean build of a distance runner rather than the compact musculature of a traditional fighter, Marcus had always been an anomaly in the Academy's rigid classification system. His reflexes were excellent, his tactical thinking sound, but, when it came to blade work, he moved like a man fighting underwater. Every instructor had told him the same thing: adjust his grip, widen his stance, commit to the forward momentum. None of it worked. The other cadets were already assembling in formation as Instructor Valdez entered the hall. A former Special Forces operative with scars mapping 3 decades of combat across his forearms, Valdez commanded respect through presence alone. His voice carried the authority of a man who had used every weapon in the display case not for points in a training exercise, but to stay alive. Today we perfect the Meridian series, Valdez announced, his voice echoing off the reinforced walls. Thrust patterns 7 through 12. These combinations have been tested in real combat for over 200 years. Master them, and you master the blade. Marcus took his position in the back row, as had become his habit. From here, he could observe the entire class while remaining relatively inconspicuous. He watched as Cadet Thompson, the top-ranked student in their year, executed the movements with mechanical precision. Each thrust followed the textbook arc, each parry deflected exactly 45 degrees from centerline. It was flawless. It was also predictable. Rivera. Valdez's voice cut through Marcus's observation. Front and center. Let's see if you've been practicing. The familiar knot of tension formed in Marcus's stomach as he moved forward. 23 pairs of eyes tracked his movement, some sympathetic, others merely curious about his latest failure. He took his position opposite Thompson, accepting the practice blade from the instructor's outstretched hand. Begin with Meridian 7, Valdez instructed. Standard approach pattern. Marcus fell into the prescribed stance, feeling immediately awkward and off balance. Thompson moved forward with textbook precision, his blade describing the exact arc demanded by doctrine. Marcus attempted the standard defense, stepping back and to the right, bringing his blade up in the classic parry position. Thompson's follow-up came exactly as the manual prescribed, and Marcus's counter-response was equally predictable. Within 6 moves, Thompson's blade was at his throat. Again, Valdez said, his tone patient but strained. Remember, Rivera, the doctrine exists because it works. Don't think so much. Trust the system. They reset. Thompson attacked with the same pattern, and Marcus attempted the same defense. This time he lasted 8 moves before finding himself disarmed entirely, his practice blade clattering across the concrete floor. A few cadets snickered. Thompson offered him a hand up with genuine sympathy. Once more, Valdez ordered, but there was something different in his voice now. Resignation, perhaps. Or the decision that some students simply couldn't be taught. Marcus retrieved his blade and took position again. But, this time, instead of falling into the standard stance, he did something that would later be described in official reports as either brilliant innovation or dangerous insubordination, depending on which administrator was writing the evaluation. He turned around. Not metaphorically, not strategically, but literally. He pivoted 180 degrees so that his back was to Thompson, the blade held low at his side in a grip that violated every principle of Academy combat doctrine. What the hell are you doing, Rivera? Valdez's voice carried a note of incredulous anger. Trying something different, sir, Marcus replied, not turning back around. He could feel Thompson's confusion behind him, could sense the entire class holding its collective breath. Turn around immediately and assume proper fighting stance. With respect, sir, I'd like to try this approach. The silence that followed was electric with tension. In 3 years at the academy, no cadet had ever refused a direct order from an instructor during combat training. The very idea was unthinkable. Military discipline demanded instant obedience, especially in matters of combat where hesitation could mean death. But Marcus wasn't hesitating. If anything, he felt more focused than he had in months. Every failed assessment, every moment of awkward fumbling with traditional techniques, had led him to this realization: he wasn't built for conventional warfare. He was built for something else entirely. Thompson, Valdez said, his voice tight with controlled fury, proceed with the attack pattern. Rivera, you have 5 seconds to turn around before this becomes a disciplinary matter. Marcus heard Thompson's footstep behind him, the whisper of steel cutting through air as the attack began. Instead of turning to meet it, Marcus did something that defied every instinct of proper blade work. He stepped backward into the attack, his own blade moving in a reverse arc that brought it up and around in a motion that looked more like a dance than a combat technique. The clash of steel rang through the hall, but instead of the sharp impact of a successful parry, it was a sliding, redirecting sound. Marcus's blade caught Thompson's thrust not head-on but tangentially, deflecting it past his left shoulder while his own weapon continued its backward arc. Thompson, committed to his forward momentum, found himself overextended and off balance. Without conscious thought, Marcus continued the motion, pivoting on his left foot while maintaining contact with Thompson's blade. His weapon traced a complex pattern that seemed to flow around Thompson's defenses rather than confronting them directly. Where traditional technique demanded forward pressure and aggressive advancement, Marcus's approach was fluid and adaptive, using his opponent's force against him. Within moments, Thompson found his blade trapped in what amounted to a steel web, his weapon neutralized not through superior force but through geometry and timing. Marcus's final movement was almost gentle, a simple twist that disarmed Thompson without injury or violence. The hall was absolutely silent. Marcus finally turned around to face the class, breathing hard but feeling more alive than he had since arriving at the academy. Thompson stared at him with open amazement, flexing his fingers where the practice blade had been smoothly extracted from his grip. Valdez looked like a man who had just witnessed the fundamental laws of physics being casually violated. What, the instructor said slowly, was that? I'm not sure, sir, Marcus admitted. I've been watching everyone fight for months, and I realized that everything we're taught assumes the enemy is in front of you. But what if they're not? What if you're surrounded, or what if you need to protect someone behind you, or what if the conventional approach just doesn't work for your body type? He gestured to his own frame, lanky and long-limbed where the ideal fighter was supposed to be compact and powerful. I can't generate the same forward momentum as Thompson. I don't have his reach advantage from a traditional stance. But if I work backward, if I use retreat as an offensive tool. That's completely contrary to established doctrine, Valdez interrupted. Combat advancement requires forward momentum. You can't win a fight by running away. But I wasn't running away, sir. I was drawing him in, controlling his advance, making him fight my fight instead of his own. Valdez was quiet for a long moment, studying Marcus with the calculating gaze of a professional warrior encountering something genuinely new. Demonstrate again. Thompson, use Meridian 9 this time. Full speed. This exchange was faster, more intense. Thompson had learned from the first encounter and approached with greater caution, but Marcus's response was equally evolved. Instead of simply stepping backward, he began to incorporate lateral movement, creating angles that traditional doctrine didn't account for. His blade work became even more fluid, less like conventional swordplay and more like an entirely different art form. The engagement lasted longer this time, with Thompson adapting his own technique to counter Marcus's unorthodox approach. But, ultimately, the result was the same. Marcus's backward-flowing style allowed him to control the distance and timing of the encounter, turning Thompson's aggression into a vulnerability. When it was over, Valdez called for a break. The instructor walked to the far end of the hall, pulling out his personal communication device. Marcus could see him speaking rapidly to someone, though the words were too quiet to overhear. "How did you think of that?" Thompson asked, approaching with genuine curiosity rather than wounded pride. "I've never seen anything like it." "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "I've been failing these assessments for months, trying to force myself into the standard approach. But, yesterday I was reading about historical fighting styles, pre-academy stuff from old Earth. Some of the Asian martial arts emphasized using an opponent's force against them, working with attack patterns rather than against them. But, those are just historical curiosities," Thompson pointed out. "Military science evolved past those techniques centuries ago." "Maybe. Or maybe we just forgot something important along the way." Valdez returned, his expression unreadable. "Rivera, report to Command Office 7 immediately after this session." "Thompson, you're with me. We're going to analyze exactly what just happened." The rest of the training period was spent with Thompson attempting to counter Marcus's backward style while the other cadets took notes. It became apparent that traditional academy doctrine had no answer for this approach. Every conventional counter technique relied on forward momentum and direct confrontation, neither of which was effective against an opponent who treated retreat as an offensive weapon. More troubling for the established order was the fact that other cadets began experimenting with variations of Marcus's technique during free practice time. Cadet Williams, who had been struggling with blade work almost as much as Marcus, found that incorporating backward movement into her defensive patterns dramatically improved her performance. Cadet Foster discovered that the fluid, redirecting motions could be adapted to work with traditional forward advancement, creating a hybrid style that was devastatingly effective. By the end of the session, Instructor Valdez was faced with something unprecedented in Academy history. A student had not only challenged established doctrine but had demonstrated a fundamental flaw in the system itself. Command Office 7 occupied the top floor of the administrative tower, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the Academy grounds. When Marcus arrived, he found not just Valdez waiting for him, but Colonel Harrison, the Director of Combat Training, and Dr. Patricia Voss, the Academy's Chief Tactical Analyst. "Sit down, Cadet Rivera," Colonel Harrison gestured to a chair positioned opposite a conference table where the three officials sat with data tablets and stylus pads spread before them. "We've been reviewing the training footage from this morning, Dr. Voss began, tapping her tablet to activate a holographic display. "Your approach represents a fundamental deviation from established combat doctrine. Before we proceed, I need to understand your motivation. Was this a planned demonstration, or an impulsive decision?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "I've been failing blade assessments for 3 months, ma'am. I was desperate to find something that worked. The backward approach was instinctive, I suppose." "Instinctive," Colonel Harrison repeated. "Cadet, military training is designed to replace instinct with proven technique. Instinct gets soldiers killed. With respect, sir, proven technique was getting me killed in every assessment. At some point, I had to try something different." Dr. Voss leaned forward, her fingers dancing across her tablet as she pulled up additional data. "Your performance metrics show a 300% improvement in combat effectiveness using this unorthodox approach. That's not a statistical anomaly, that's a fundamental paradigm shift. The question," Instructor Valdez interjected, "is whether this represents an innovation we should explore or a dangerous deviation we need to correct." What followed was a 3-hour examination that felt more like a doctoral defense than a disciplinary hearing. Marcus was required to explain not just what he had done, but why he believed it worked, how it could be systematically taught, and what implications it might have for Academy doctrine as a whole. The breakthrough moment came when Dr. Voss asked him to describe the psychological component of his approach. "Traditional blade work is about imposing your will on an opponent," Marcus explained. "You advance, you attack, you claim space. It's fundamentally about dominance. But my approach is about adaptation. Instead of imposing my fighting style on Thompson, I adapted to his style and made it work for me." "Elaborate," Colonel Harrison ordered. "Every human has weaknesses, sir. Physical limitations, psychological patterns, ingrained habits. Traditional doctrine tries to overcome those weaknesses through training and discipline.
But what if instead of fighting our weaknesses, we made them into strengths?
Marcus stood and moved to the holographic display, calling up the training footage from the morning.
Look at my body type. I'm tall, lean, not built for close-quarters power fighting. Traditional doctrine says I need to overcome that limitation. But what if that limitation is actually an advantage in the right context?
He manipulated the display to show the engagement from multiple angles. My reach disadvantage in traditional forward fighting becomes a reach advantage when I'm drawing an opponent in. My lack of raw power becomes irrelevant when I'm using their power against them. My tendency toward defensive thinking becomes an offensive weapon when retreat becomes attack. Dr. Voss was taking rapid notes, her academic excitement barely contained. You're describing adaptive combat theory. The idea that optimal fighting technique should vary based on individual physiology and psychology rather than adherence to universal doctrine.
I suppose so, ma'am. Though I'd never heard of adaptive combat theory before today. Because it doesn't exist, Colonel Harrison said bluntly.
Military effectiveness depends on standardization, on every soldier being able to predict and rely on every other soldier's responses.
What you're proposing would create chaos.
Or, Dr. Voss countered, it would create soldiers who are impossible for enemies to predict because their techniques are individually optimized rather than institutionally standardized. The debate that followed revealed deep philosophical divisions within the Academy's leadership about the nature of military training itself. Colonel Harrison represented the traditional view that military effectiveness came from discipline, standardization, and the suppression of individual variation in favor of proven group tactics. Dr. Voss advocated for what she called evolutionary combat doctrine, the idea that military technique should adapt and evolve rather than remaining static. Instructor Valdez found himself in the middle, a practical warrior trying to balance theoretical possibilities against real-world requirements. The technique works, he admitted grudgingly.
Rivera's improvement is undeniable.
But implementing this kind of individualized training across the entire academy would require completely rebuilding our curriculum. Maybe it's time for that rebuilding, Dr. Voss suggested. Our current doctrine was developed for conflicts with other human militaries using similar techniques and equipment. But we're facing new threats now. Non-human adversaries with completely different physiologies and fighting styles. Artificial intelligences that can predict and counter any standardized approach.
The very standardization that's been our strength might become our weakness.
The meeting concluded without resolution, but with a decision that would reshape Marcus's academy experience entirely.
He would be enrolled in an experimental program, working with Dr. Voss to develop and test adaptive combat techniques.
His training would continue, but it would be individualized, focused on maximizing his unique advantages rather than conforming to universal standards. More significantly, he would be authorized to teach his backward fighting style to other cadets who showed similar body types or psychological profiles. The academy would begin, cautiously and experimentally, to explore whether combat doctrine could be individualized without sacrificing unit cohesion.
The next 6 months transformed Training Hall 7 into something resembling a research laboratory more than a traditional military facility.
Dr. Voss established what she called adaptive combat protocols, systematically analyzing each cadet's physical and psychological profile to determine optimal fighting techniques. The results were remarkable and troubling in equal measure. Cadet Williams, who had struggled with traditional blade work, proved to have an intuitive understanding of defensive counterattacks that made her nearly unbeatable when she fought from a protective stance. Cadet Foster's background as a dancer translated into a flowing, almost artistic combat style that was beautiful to watch and devastatingly effective. Cadet Chen, who had always been average in traditional assessments, revealed an ability to read and counter opponent patterns that bordered on precognition. But the most dramatic transformation was in Marcus himself. Freed from the constraints of traditional doctrine, his backward fighting style evolved into something far more sophisticated than the instinctive technique he had first demonstrated. Working with Dr. Voss, he began to understand the mathematical principles underlying his approach: optimal angles for deflection, timing patterns for counterattacks, spatial relationships that maximized leverage while minimizing force requirements. The philosophical implications became clearer as the program developed. Traditional military doctrine was based on the assumption that there was one optimal way to fight, and that proper training could teach any individual to approximate that ideal. But the adaptive combat protocols suggested something far more complex, that optimal fighting technique was not universal but individual, not fixed but contextual, not imposed but discovered. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, Marcus wrote in his training journal during the 4th month of the experimental program. I used to think that meant overcoming my limitations through discipline and training.
But I think it means something different now. It means recognizing that what looks like weakness might actually be strength in the right context.
The entry was prompted by a sparring session with Thompson, who had initially been skeptical of the adaptive approach but had gradually become one of its strongest advocates. Thompson's traditional technique remained devastatingly effective against conventional opponents, but he had learned to incorporate elements of Marcus's backward style when facing unpredictable or unorthodox fighters. "You've changed how I think about combat entirely," Thompson told Marcus after a particularly intense training session. "I used to see fighting as a contest of wills, my technique against theirs.
But now I see it as a conversation.
They make a statement, I respond, they counter-respond, and the winner is whoever tells the better story." That metaphor, combat as conversation rather than conquest, became central to Dr. Voss's theoretical framework. In traditional doctrine, the goal was to impose your narrative on the opponent, to make them fight your fight according to your rules. But adaptive combat was about listening to what your opponent was saying through their movements, understanding their story, and finding ways to make that story work in your favor. The breakthrough that validated the entire experimental program came during the Academy's annual inter-service competition. For the first time in Academy history, the combat training team dominated not through superior execution of traditional techniques, but through approaches so novel that their opponents had no framework for countering them. Marcus's own performance was the capstone of the competition. Facing a Special Forces operative with 15 years of real combat experience, he initially appeared completely outmatched. The operative was faster, stronger, more experienced, and more aggressive. Using traditional doctrine, Marcus would have been defeated in moments. Instead, he employed what Dr. Voss had termed adaptive yielding. Rather than meeting the operative's aggression directly, Marcus absorbed and redirected it, using the opponent's experience and training against him. Every technique the operative employed was textbook perfect, which made his responses predictable. Marcus's counter techniques were improvised and contextual, making them impossible to anticipate. The engagement lasted nearly 10 minutes, an eternity in blade combat, and ended not with a dramatic finishing move but with a simple displacement that left the operative off balance and vulnerable. It was a victory achieved not through superior force or even superior technique, but through superior adaptation. The official report filed by Dr. Voss following the competition was classified at the highest levels, but its conclusions would influence military training doctrine for generations to come. The fundamental assumption underlying centuries of military education, that optimal technique was universal and could be taught through standardized curricula, was not just wrong but counterproductive. Individual variation is not a bug in the human system, Dr. Voss wrote. It's a feature. Our diversity of physical and psychological types represents an adaptive advantage that standardized training actively suppresses. An enemy who knows our doctrine can predict and counter our responses. An enemy facing truly adaptive fighters confronts an incalculable number of variables. The report's most revolutionary recommendation was the complete restructuring of academy combat training around individual assessment and adaptive technique development. Instead of teaching every cadet the same fighting style, instructors would work with each student to discover and develop their optimal approach based on their unique combination of physical capabilities, psychological patterns, and strategic preferences. Implementation of this recommendation would take years and would face resistance from traditionalists throughout the military hierarchy. But the proof of concept was undeniable. Marcus Rivera, the cadet who had failed every traditional assessment, had become one of the most formidable fighters in academy history not by overcoming his limitations, but by transforming them into advantages. The final documentation in his academy file included a note from instructor Valdez, the traditional warrior who had initially been most skeptical of Marcus's approach, Cadet Rivera has demonstrated that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from following the path, but from having the courage to turn around and walk backward until you find your own way. On graduation day, as Marcus stood with his class in the Academy's Great Hall, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The backward fighting style that had emerged from desperation had evolved into something far more significant, a new understanding of what it meant to be strong. True strength, he had learned, was not about imposing your will on the world or forcing yourself into predetermined patterns of success. True strength was about understanding yourself so completely that you could find advantage in any situation, could adapt to any challenge, could turn even apparent weakness into tactical superiority. The motto inscribed above the Academy's main entrance read "Victory through discipline." It was a noble sentiment that had guided military training for centuries. But Marcus had learned a different truth, one that he would carry with him through his military career and beyond. Sometimes victory came not through discipline, but through the wisdom to know when to break the rules. As he accepted his commission as a second lieutenant in the Terran Defense Force, Marcus carried with him not just his own hard-won understanding of adaptive combat, but responsibility for a fundamental shift in how the military understood human potential. His backward fighting style had become a symbol of something larger, the recognition that individual differences were not obstacles to overcome but resources to develop. The Academy's knife lesson had been rewritten not through superior knowledge or advanced technology, but through the simple act of one person having the courage to turn around and face the world from a different direction. In doing so, he had discovered not just a new way to fight, but a new way to think about what it meant to be human in a universe that demanded constant adaptation. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Marcus had learned that this destruction was not about elimination but transformation, not about becoming someone else but about becoming more fully himself. In turning backward, he had moved forward into a future where strength was measured not by conformity but by the courage to be different. His story would be studied, analyzed, and eventually mythologized in the years that followed. But the truth at its heart remains simple and profound. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting harder, but from fighting smarter, not from being stronger, but from being more yourself. The Academy's knife lesson had been fundamentally rewritten by a young man who refused to accept that his differences were deficiencies, who had the insight to recognize that the system wasn't broken, it was simply incomplete. In adding his own chapter to the military's understanding of combat, Marcus Rivera had demonstrated that evolution comes not from perfecting existing approaches, but from having the courage to explore entirely new ones. As his class dispersed to their various assignments across the galaxy, Marcus carried with him the knowledge that he had helped change not just how soldiers fought, but how they thought about fighting. The backward style that had emerged from personal necessity had become a universal principle, that true mastery comes not from suppressing individuality, but from embracing it completely. The Academy's halls would echo with different sounds in the years to come, as future generations of cadets learned not just traditional doctrine but adaptive techniques tailored to their individual natures. And, at the center of that new understanding would be the simple truth that Marcus had discovered on that morning when he turned around and faced his opponent from an impossible direction. Sometimes the best way forward is backward, sometimes the greatest strength comes from acknowledged weakness, and sometimes the most important lesson is the one that teaches us to unlearn everything we thought we knew. End of documentation. Classification, released for general distribution. Date of declassification, July 22, 2199. Authority, Military Historical Archive. Commission. Note: the techniques described in this document have become standard components of modern military training. Cadet Rivera's adaptive combat methodology has been credited with saving thousands of lives in subsequent conflicts with non-human adversaries. His approach to individual optimization has been extended beyond combat training to include strategic planning, leadership development, and diplomatic relations. The Academy's official motto was revised in 2180 to read, "Victory through understanding." This change reflects the fundamental shift in military philosophy that began with the events documented above.